We're currently in a series called Seek First, which is going to take us through till the end of November. It's all about the kingdom of God. And the title that I've given this talk is The Offensive Kingdom. And I think it's worth knowing right at the start that this talk is rated PG. So if any of your little darlings come upstairs for any reason whatsoever, you have been warned. Now, this talk is an invitation to follow Jesus into the darkest places imaginable, to proclaim the coming of God's kingdom and extend his saving love to the people who we may only theoretically believe that God has included. Now, what I've got is a fair bit of context in the lead up before we get to our passage for today. I hope that you will find this interesting. But going way back to set this all in context, the people of God, Israel's story begins with a man named Abraham, who God calls out from among all the other nations and says, I'm going to bless you, and from you will come a great nation. You will be blessed in order that every nation, every people group upon the earth will be blessed too. That said, the inclusion of Gentiles in the Old Testament gets a little bit forgotten and ignored, and the prophets are often reminding the people to pay attention to this. Isaiah reminded the people 700 years before Jesus, saying in chapter 60, let no foreigner, that's a non-Jewish person, a Gentile, who is bound to the Lord, say, the Lord will surely exclude me from his people. I will bring them to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. The sovereign Lord declares, he who gathers the exiles of Israel, I will gather still others to them beside those already gathered. And whilst we see many instances within the Old Testament of foreigners being treated with kindness, it's often forgotten or ignored. And as their theology develops, it changes. Now, by the time we get to the first century, it's an entirely different story. And I think in part, this has something to do with being oppressed for centuries by many, many different Gentile nations. I think that sense of what we're meant to do with these people begins to wear thin. So I think by the time the Romans have arrived, I think virtually all Jews, not all, but virtually all Jews would absolutely despise their Roman occupiers. And what came about was a fairly derogatory term for Gentiles among the Jewish people. Not all, but many Jewish people would call Gentiles dogs. Not dogs like this. Not dogs like this. Dogs in Jesus' day were never kept as pets. They are feral street pests. They were ferocious. If they were kept as semi-pets, they were guard dogs. They were wild, and they were there to protect their property. So when Jesus sends out the 12 disciples, he tells them, don't go among the Gentiles, but instead to the lost sheep of Israel, because he knew that to be who he is called to. However, Jesus did, in fact, go to many Gentiles in the time of his ministry over those 3 years, and many Gentiles came to him as well. And I think what we miss when we read the Gospels is just how uncomfortable this would have been for his disciples, how it would have been uncomfortable for the crowds who surrounded him. For many Jews, particularly those brought up in the Galilee where many of the disciples came from, the Pharisee territory, they were required to maintain ceremonial cleanliness. Gentiles, however, were ceremonially unclean. They weren't required to keep the law of Moses, but they did engage in all sorts of immoral behavior, making them morally impure. They may have eaten unclean foods. And so for the Jews trying to maintain purity, they wanted to avoid the Jews at all costs. So basically, Jews kept themselves away from Gentiles wherever it was possible. If they did come into contact with Gentiles, they'd have to go through some ceremonial cleansing process. And so when Jesus does, in fact, come into contact with Gentiles, again, I think we miss just how shocking this would have been for the disciples and for the first readers of the Gospels. Just imagine for a moment that you have been brought up for the whole of your young life, your adolescence, being told to avoid this particular people group over here for the whole of your life. If you speak about them, the way you describe them is dogs. Their religious practices offend you. Their ethical lives make you feel sick to your stomach. And then you see Jesus, who claims to be the Messiah, going right up to them. And what I want to do is I want to give you a sort of a picture of what this might be like on this map to help you understand. Now, this area here is called the Galilee. And this is Pharisee heartland. So right at the very top, and I have just scribbled over it, over the Sea of Galilee, there are 3 little towns here, Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Chorazin. And this, just so you know, is where 95% of the Gospels takes place. So when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 95% of what you read is happening in that little triangle there. Obviously, sometimes he ventures out. We'll come on to that in just a moment. But this little triangle, Jesus walks between these different groups. He encounters people, and he's preaching the gospel. He's healing the sick. He's casting out demons. Now, the Pharisees, they're based here. And what they're trying to do is produce some sort of a holiness hotspot. So their understanding for the why they are in this situation, as in being in a land that is oppressed by the Romans, is that it's because of their sin. That they have not kept their side of God's covenant, and God has allowed for them to be overtaken. And so their belief is that we're not like zealots. Zealots may kill a Roman soldier if they see one. They may start trying to sort of start a rebellion against the Romans. The Pharisees think, no, if we obey, if we remain true to the covenant that we have been called to, then God will sovereignly remove the Romans for us, and then we will be able to be the people that we are called to be. And so obviously the Pharisees, they put on all these laws upon laws, as you know in the Gospels, it's called a heavy yoke upon the people. Now, you might be looking at that map and going, well, I don't know my Bible that much, but I know that Jerusalem's important. So if they're like the godly ones, why are they not there? Now, this region down here is called Judea, which, of course, Jerusalem is part of, as you can see on the map. And if you are a good law-abiding Jew, you do need to go to Jerusalem. You do need to go to the temple in order to do the sacrifice that you may receive atonement and do other festivals like that. But the Pharisee interpretation of what's happened in Jerusalem is that they're sellouts. The Sadducees who run the temple, they're basically corrupt. They're overtaxing the people who have already been taxed heavily by the Romans. They are corrupt. They are colluding with their Roman oppressors so they may maintain their power. Another group that Jesus comes in contact with a little bit are the Herodians, and they're there. And I feel like they're like the people who live in the capital at Panem. They're like Jews. They like synagogue. They like temple, but actually they're really glad for the plumbing that the Romans brought with them. And they do quite enjoy the theater as well. So they're based there. Now, you go, yeah, well, that's fairly straightforward. It's corrupt. We want to maintain holiness, but we kind of have to get on with what we're doing. So we live up here in the Galilee. A couple of times a year we need to head down to Jerusalem, so we'll just walk straight through here to Jerusalem. No! This is called Samaria. And if you have heard the story of the Good Samaritan, you'll know that was a shocking story, because what on earth is a Good Samaritan? They're terrible. Can anything good come from Samaria? This is a group where they're not Gentiles, but they're like semi-Gentiles. They've walked away from the people of God. They've been worshipping idols sometime in their history. And so if you want to maintain ceremonial cleanliness on your pilgrimage to the temple, you're not going through Samaria. So instead, what you're doing, and this is the Jordan River here, you are then going to walk through Perea. So you're coming from the Galilee, you cross the river into Perea and down into Jerusalem. Now, Perea is not the name that is used in the Gospels. We don't read that word at all. What we hear is east of the Jordan, or the other side of the Jordan, or across the Jordan. And this is where John the Baptist and his followers are based. And so they may walk past John the Baptist, get baptized in the river on their way. And so John the Baptist there, he's with his disciples, and he's training them to basically prepare the way for the coming Messiah. Notice that John the Baptist is here. He sets himself apart from the corruption at the temple, and he sets himself apart from what the Pharisees are doing as well. I think that's interesting. And then you'll notice there's one other area here, which is called the Decapolis. And if you studied Latin, I did not study Latin, but I did watch the Olympics. Decathlon, 10 events. Deca means 10, polis, metropolis. It's 10 cities that were built by the Greeks and then rebuilt by the Romans. And these are state-of-the-art cities where they would have aqueducts bringing water into the city and plumbing taking all the sewage out. There'd be universities and theaters and schools and hospitals, and it'd all be paved and be very straightforward. You go, fantastic. That sounds like a great place to be. Well, no, because if you're from here, you think that all of this is your land, or ought to be your land. It shouldn't be occupied. And we don't want you here, because yes, you may have brought plumbing with you, but so have you brought your temples. And you're engaging in all sorts of idolatrous worship and pagan worship that's completely other to how we expect or hope God to be. And so they completely avoid it. Now, this map brings into mind for me a couple of stories where we see Jesus, who spends 95% of his time in the Galilee, actually stepping into the red. So you'll know the story where Jesus is setting out towards Jerusalem, and he goes straight through Samaria, meets the woman at the well. And obviously he speaks to her, tells her things that she thought nobody could possibly know about her. And she goes back and tells all of her friends about it, or the people in her village, and many of them come to know Jesus. I think we miss just how shocking and horrifying this would have been for Jesus' disciples. They'd have gone, we don't go to Samaria. We go round Samaria. We're going to become ceremonially unclean. Another story is when Jesus tells the disciples to get into the boat and cross the lake to the other side. And the disciples, they argue with him. They say, no, we can't do that. And again, we miss it, but you do not answer back to your rabbi. It's just not the way that things are done. And so they get into the boat. Jesus quickly falls asleep, and then a storm swells up. And you just imagine the disciples going, oh, we're going to die. But also, this is obviously judgment because we're not meant to go there. And when they get there, the first thing they meet is people like pig farmers, unclean animals. The people on that side just do not keep it the way it's meant to be. But then Jesus does, in fact, minister in the Decapolis, heals many, and begins to build a following from there. So, again, I just think it's difficult to describe the distaste that the people would have had for Gentiles. Jesus' first recorded encounter with a Gentile in his ministry is with the centurion in Matthew chapter 8. And as part of the Roman occupying military force, the centurion would have represented everything that the Jews hated about Rome. And Matthew's writing to a Jewish audience. And so when Jesus arrives in Capernaum, the centurion basically asks to meet Jesus, asking for a miracle. So I think that people would have been used to Roman centurions ordering people what to do, but to hear a Roman basically ask for a favor, please come and help me, I think, again, shocking in the first, shocking for the people who had to read Matthew's gospel afterwards. Jesus responded by saying, shall I come and heal him? And again, Matthew's readers would be like, no, we don't go to Gentiles' houses. We'll become ceremonially unclean. You can't possibly go, Jesus. And then the centurion offers a surprising response by stating, no, I'm not worthy to have you in my house. So again, the Jewish listeners are going, oh yeah, I agree with the centurion. Who thought that was going to happen? Further bewilderment for Matthew's audience as the centurion then told Jesus, there's no need to come to his home, only say the word and my servant will be healed. And Jesus says, truly, I've not seen anybody in Israel with such faith as this. So Jesus was saying both to the original audience, both to his disciples who were saying it, and the first readers of Matthew's gospel, is that this Gentile had more faith than any person from Israel, any Jew he had met. Now, the theological term for this is called a kick in the teeth. And I can see that might be why Matthew has included it in his gospel. Now, for our reading today that I really want to focus on now is where Jesus takes his disciples way out of their comfort zone, out of the comfort of the Triangle of Galilee into the darkest, most pagan Gentile spaces they could possibly imagine. So again, back to the map, you can see I've circled it in red. Jesus takes his disciples to Caesarea Philippi. It's just 25 miles north of the Galilee, but this city's religious practices would have been absolutely abhorrent to the Jewish people, wildly different. Now, in Old Testament times, the northeastern area became a sort of a center for Baal worship. Baal was a fertility god. If you know the story of Elijah ends up in a contest with the prophets of Baal, if you remember. And when the Greeks then conquered and overtook the land, it became a religious center for the Greek god Pan, another fertility god, so same sort of vibe, but different name. And if you know your Greek mythology, Pan is like half goat, half human, and then they named the city Panias, which if you can see, is what it's called on the map there. Years later, when the Romans conquered the territory, Herod Philip, who had authority over the region, rebuilt the city and then renamed the city after the Emperor Caesar and himself. Caesar, Caesarea, Philip, Philippi. This is called brown-nosing. This is how you make friends with your boss. That's just an aside. My daughter's name is Noah John. No. Caesarea Philippi continues to be a focus of worship for the Greek gods like Pan for some time afterwards. Now, this is an artist's impression of the cliff that stood above the city. And local people would have shrines and temples to Pan. And this is what they would have looked like. And the arrow pointing there is called the Court of Pan, or the Grotto of Pan. Here it is today. I don't know whether they're still doing tours of Israel at the moment, but it's there and people can visit it. And here it is from another angle. And you're going to see the water that is pouring out of it. This is one of the sources for the River Jordan, and inside is a cave that had a very, very deep pool. The ancient historian Josephus, who wrote a lot of the history that we have about the external to the New Testament Gospels, basically said that the spring of water, they tried to plumb its depths, basically get a really long rope with a weight on it and see how far it went, and they just ran out of rope. It was just so deep, they never found the end of it. It just went on for miles and miles and miles. So in this cave is a seemingly deep pool of water, and out of the rock would come this rushing white rapids of water. I know it looks quite tame there. A couple of centuries later, there was an earthquake that re-diverted the water another way. But I think you have to imagine a huge sum of water traveling out of there. So the pagan Gentiles of Jesus' day commonly believed that their fertility gods lived underground in the underworld during the winter, then came out during the spring. And archaeologists say that this is a theme that we see across cultures around the world, a very common belief. And they saw water as a symbol of the underworld. They believed their gods traveled to and from that world through caves. So to the pagan mind, this cave at Caesarea Philippi created a gate to the underworld, and it literally was the gates of hell. And they worshipped the god Pan here. They celebrated Pan. They had an annual festival called, you guessed it, Pandemonium. I'm not even joking. This is where the word comes from. Pan, the half goat, half man deity, fertility thing. Demon, don't need to explain that. And Eum, day. Pan Demon Day, a wild, noisy, disorderly festival. And it's estimated that nearly 1 million people would have come each year to celebrate the Pan cult, the sex fertility cult. Now, in order to entice the return of their god, Pan, from the underworld each year, the people of Caesarea Philippi engaged in pagan activities. Historians claimed that they sacrificed so many goats in the pit that the white rapids turned blood red. They threw infants into the water alive. It being a sex fertility cult, orgies played an important part of the worship, and Pan being half goat, men engaged in bestial relations with goats. Now, there is no good way to speak about the profanity that took place at Caesarea Philippi. And if you're feeling any sense of unease within yourself, even with the PG warning I gave at the start, and you're thinking, why are you saying these things in church? Imagine what it would have been like for the disciples. Imagine how they would have felt. Imagine they had a hard time going through Samaria. They had a hard time crossing the lake in the Decapolis. How do they feel going 25 miles north to Caesarea Philippi? They are squirming. None of them want to be here. If they've heard even a glimpse of what goes on here, they know they don't want to go anywhere near these despicable acts. And it doesn't say whether Jesus and his disciples arrived during the festival. It does not matter. Them and Matthew's audience who read his Gospels in the first, shortly afterward, they would know that Jesus has led them way, way, way out of their comfort zone. So, with that context, let me read our passage, which I'm sure is familiar. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. So, few points that I just want to draw out of this, what I presume is a familiar passage. Jesus asked them, "Who do the people say I am?" And he does this a number of times in the various Gospels. And I think it's always interesting because it kind of paints a picture of what the crowd made of Jesus, what they thought or what they perceived of Jesus when they came into contact with him. So some say you're John the Baptist. I wonder what we can infer from this. Like, is Jesus a bit like his cousin, John? Is it because he attracted large crowds just like John? Is it perhaps because he has this challenging, unwavering teaching? Maybe Jesus is humble like John, who always pointed away from himself but to the Lamb of God. Perhaps he's strong. Perhaps he's bold enough to challenge wrongdoing, just like John was with Herod. Some say Elijah. Maybe that's because Elijah he had an amazing ministry for performing miracles. Or perhaps it was the way he called the people back to the worship of God, just like Elijah did with the prophets of Baal, back to the covenant. Elijah's also known as the fiery prophet, which makes sense because he has this contest where he calls down fire upon the mountain. He also ascends into heaven on a chariot of fire as well. But he's also fiery in his character. He's fiery in his nature. Like, he really speaks up and with audacity and challenges people. So perhaps Jesus is like that as well. And so maybe we need to give white Jesus with a lamb on his shoulders a bit of a rest, because the crowd seems to be getting a slightly different take on who he is. Still, others say he's like Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah is often known as the weeping prophet. He is if you've ever read it, it's a gloomy book, and he expresses grief, the grief for his people. He prophesied at a time when his people were being carted off, exiled out of their land into Babylon. A great time of sorrow and anger towards their oppressors. But Jeremiah's message is often perceived as being quite pro-Babylon. Like, everything's being destroyed, but let's just not run from our story. We made our bed, now we might as well lie in it. And I wonder whether maybe Jesus' message of forgiving our enemies is perceived as being so pro-Roman, they think, it's just like having Jeremiah back again. Verse 15. But what about you, he asked, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. This is a big moment for Peter. He is being praised in front of all the other disciples. He's got the answer right. And then Jesus says, I tell you that you are Peter. Peter, as I'm sure you know, means rock, by the way. You are Peter, the rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now, this verse has had two main interpretations in Christian history throughout the centuries. Did anybody grow up Catholic? Does anybody know what the Catholic Church understands as who or what the rock that Jesus is going to build his church on? Arabella? Yeah. No, who do they think the rock is? Peter. Maybe I asked the question wrong. But yeah, you're right. Peter, the first pope. So the Roman Catholic Church claims that the rock which Christ will build his church is Peter, in that he's the first leader among the apostles. There's his apostolic succession, which is handed down all the way through the papacy. However, Reformed Christians believe the rock is something else altogether. Anybody know? Sunday school answer? Very good. Christ. Yeah. So Protestant Christians claim that the rock is Christ based on Peter's confession of faith. They point to Peter in his own letter and Paul's letter in 1 Corinthians, where they both call Christ the rock. Also, they point out that Peter, or Petros, means stone, a detached, very large boulder, but a detached stone, whereas rock means a solid rock formation or a cliff face. Jesus isn't building his church on a stone, he's building it on something much bigger than that, which again, I think is a fair argument from the language. Let me, however, offer a third interpretation of the rock that Jesus will build his church on, based on the context we've just heard. Jesus has marched his disciples 25 miles north from the comfort and safety of Galilee. He's gone there on purpose. It's not on the way to anything. He's in pagan, Gentile heartland, the center of worship of a God which would be utterly abominable to all of the Jews. And Peter's confession of faith in Jesus the Messiah, the Son of the living God, he changes Simon's name to Peter. I tell you that you are Petros, and on this Petra I will build my church. On this bedrock, on this cliff face, on this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. So, yeah, Peter, the Pope, fine. Yes, the confession of faith, fine. But also the rock Jesus is speaking about, the very gates of hell themselves, the center of pandemonium. Jesus saying, I'm not going to build my church in the safe, comfortable corner of Galilee you've been used to. I'm going to build it right here in the chaos, in the mess, in this paganism, this Gentile heartland, and it will not prevail against what my kingdom will do. First basic observation about this claim is that Jesus' movement in the world is offensive and not defensive. Have you grown up with a faith that has told you to play it safe? Don't go to dangerous places. Make sure your worship service and your lives are orderly, controlled, and tidy. Don't forget your quiet time. Jesus takes his disciples out of their comfort and charges headlong into the chaos where his peace is needed most. He employs his peace at the epicenter of the darkness, and that's where he brings his light. And he's trusting Peter, he's trusting his disciples, he's trusting every follower that comes after these to do exactly the same. He's entrusted them with the keys of his kingdom, with the authority and the promise that his kingdom, his light, his peace, his power is greater and it will not be overcome. Are you with me? And the disciples did it, didn't they? Jesus' death, his resurrection, his ascension, the outpouring of the Spirit at Pentecost, the disciples left the comfort of the Galilee. They left the comfort of Jerusalem and they carried his light to the far corners of the earth. If you have heard this message of Jesus, it's because someone has gone out of their way to share it with you. The disciples went. This story is about us. Every one of us. We are the people walking in great darkness who have seen a light. We are the dogs. We are the ones lost in senseless sin, but Jesus has made a way for us to be brought in, to be set free from the darkness and powers that keep us from being who we are created to be. And then he's empowered us and he's equipped us to go out with his authority into the darkness and to bring others home. If you have heard this message of Jesus, it's because someone has gone out of their way to share it with you. So many people need the love and the light of Jesus. And there are people all around the world who are just going to the darkest places to take it. I saw this week on the Open Doors website that a church leader in Iran has been released from prison, a 10-year prison sentence for basically just starting a church in Iran. There are people going right to the very ends, into the darkest places, and proclaiming that a light has come. There are bold people who are just taking the gospel. And all of us, we are part of this inheritance. We are part of this story. We all play our part, going to people, going to places where we just think, oh gosh, surely the gospel's not going to go there, but we are part of this inheritance. We're part of this story. It's amazing to be part of a church where everybody is welcome. Everybody who might feel that they've been excluded from other places, they can come here and they can call this place their home. And it's good to be this welcoming place. But this week, we've been people who've been sent out these last few weeks. We've gone out and we've found people. We're calling people home. Even if your friends didn't come to the life course, you've done amazing work and you have followed in the footsteps of the disciples who've gone before us. Our world looks different because the way the disciples and the life of the Spirit has changed this world. And so I want to encourage you all and say thank you once again for what you have done this week. This is the real stuff. This is the real stuff where we proclaim God's life and light. Let us never stop being people who have confidence in Jesus, knowing that the very gates of hell will not prevail. He is with us. He goes with us. And we have to keep going. The kingdom, the keys of the kingdom are basically, they're in our grasp. And so, just as I come to an end, maybe Amalia can come up. I just want to just say once more that the life course is this Wednesday night. And if you are new to the church and you haven't come, this is one of the ways that we help people come into an encounter with the living God, to see him. We proclaim him. We preach who Jesus is, and we invite people to respond. So you yourself, you may feel like you've not heard this message yourself, and my invitation to you is to sign up. Sally will be at the back. But there may also be people who you've kind of written off. And in this process, you've heard lots of talks. You thought, yeah, but not them. Yes, I can ask these people, not these people. I'm just going to put it to you now. The gates of hell will not prevail. The Spirit is with you. The Spirit is with you. He's given you all that you need. And we really... just be with us as we do the life course over the next couple of weeks. Please join us in prayer for this. Amen. Please stand. We're going to sing a song and then we'll pray for people.